Welcome to this session on college transition planning for students with disabilities. It is our hope through this presentation that we will better prepare you and your student for life after high school and to be a successful and gain the skills to be a successful college student. Let's start off talking about some of the differences between high school and college. Oftentimes, students find the transition coming from high school to college to be pretty significant. Let's look at some of the ways that students find some of these differences. In high school, students have many people advocating for them: teachers, counselors, parents. In college, students are expected to be their own best self-advocate. Many times they need to approach professors themselves, service offices such as the Office for Students with Disabilities. They need to be able to speak for themselves and advocate their needs effectively. We're going to talk later on in this presentation about some ways that students can start practicing doing those things right now. We often think of high school students as more dependent, often needing guidance from teachers, parents to try to move along in what they need to do and motivation, where college students really need to be independent and self-motivated. They need to seek out the services and supports they need. They are not going to be forced to do anything like get tutoring or go for extra help. These are things that they are going to have to initiate independently on their own. In high school classes, important information is usually covered in class. Where in college, a lot of times the research and information gathering and a majority of the integration of material from the textbook and other sources are done outside of class, researched by the student on their own time. This is a big shift for many high school students transitioning to college, is the amount of outside work they need to do on their own in order to be successful. A lot of times in the high school environment, the school arranges the students' accommodations and services and sort of provides them right to the student. In college, a student needs to work with the Office of Student of Disabilities, sometimes called the Access Office on campus, to arrange for their accommodation, and the student is expected to communicate with professors about their accommodations and what their needs are. What is some documentation that may be required at the college level? It's a good idea to have an up-to-date psychological evaluation done to be able to present to college. It's suggested that it be at least not longer than 3 years since the evaluation, and the evaluation should be an adult measure. So you want to check with your high school personnel to make sure that your son or daughter's information is as up to date as possible. An IEP is a individualized education plan, and this is a high school document. Once a student graduates from high school, the IEP is really not a legally binding document anymore. It can be helpful to colleges to see what was on an IEP, but it was a plan that's developed with the high school and for high school students. An IEP alone does not always substantiate the need for accommodations in college. Remember, the college accommodations are based on having a disability and what may be an accommodation that's reasonable for that disability. So they're going to be looking for a diagnosis and recommendations from a professional about what accommodations might be needed based on that diagnosis. Other reports also may come into play: speech language, physical therapy, occupational therapy. Be aware of that. It just depends on the accommodation and the area of disability. We suggest that you send your documentation to the Disability Support Office on the campus that you're applying to, and not necessarily the admissions office. This way it gets right to the office that needs the information, and you may want to send this information after the student has been accepted to the college. Once a student's been accepted to the college and you feel like they've received the disability documentation, we suggest that the student follows up with the Disability Support Office at that college to make sure the documentation has been received and confirm what next steps there are. Many colleges have orientation meetings with students before their accommodations are in place. So you really want to follow up once the documentation's been sent to see if there's any other steps that the student may need to take. What's considered a reasonable accommodation at a college? Often it is a modification or an adjustment to a course, program, or services which ensures that a qualified student with a disability is not excluded, segregated, or otherwise treated differently. The definition of reasonable accommodation can vary according to institution. And oftentimes what's not reasonable is that the fundamental nature of a course or a curriculum or a program will be changed. So, for example, if a degree requirement requires a math class in order to graduate, just because a student has an area of disability in math does not necessarily mean that that math requirement is going to be waived or substituted. Another example of what might not be reasonable are services that are personal in nature, such as private tutoring or one-on-one support aids in the classroom. In addition, a lot of times things that are deemed not reasonable often result in undue administrative or financial burden for an institution or pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others. It is often important to have individual conversations with the accessibility, student disability office on a campus that you're applying to see if the accommodations your son or daughter is requesting are considered reasonable. Some typical accommodations in college that you often see might be extended time on tests or exams, testing with reduced distraction, maybe in a location other than the testing center or the classroom, use of a word processor, use of a calculator. One word about use of a calculator is many colleges are going to make sure that if a student gets a use of a calculator, that they also have an area of disability related to mathematics. So you want to be careful about that. Some high schools might approve the use of a calculator, but it does not always tie back to an area of disability in math. Many colleges are going to make sure that if a student gets the use of a calculator, there is an area of concern in learning math or a disability in math. So be aware of that. Oftentimes notes are provided either from a student in class or possibly a faculty member. This can vary from institution to institution and different courses. Some people have paid note takers in college classes, others do not. So you want to check if getting copies of notes are important for you, and they're definitely important in college. You want to find out how that institution provides notes. Textbooks in alternate format can be where you get access to the textbook in an audio format so you can hear it as well as read it. Assistive technology such as Dragon and text-to-speech software and enlarged print. This is by no means an all-inclusive list of accommodations. These are just the more commonly found accommodations in college. Some accommodations that are not usually provided by college. We've covered this one. One-on-one aids are usually not provided by a college. A set-aside resource room just for students with disabilities. This is usually not provided. Tutoring is usually available to all students on a college campus who seek it. A student is not necessarily made to do tutoring in college, so that's an important an important distinction. No one usually is there to follow up on individual assignments or progress for a student. That is up to the student. There are some colleges that provide that kind of one-on-one follow-up at an additional cost. So you want to ask if your college that you're thinking about going to provides that kind of service. But again, there usually is a cost to that. Also in college, you don't often find live readers for exams. Usually the college will train a student in reading software, and the student uses reading software to read the exam. So what can your son or daughter do now to prepare for college? We often recommend that students start speaking up for themselves or self-advocating. This could be presenting during their annual review process for their IEP. It can be as simple as trying to make phone calls for appointments for doctor's appointments or dentist appointments. Writing emails. It doesn't mean that they don't have help from their parents writing an email to a teacher or somebody else, but getting them in the habit of being able to advocate for themselves and speak up for what their needs are. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just starting to get into that habit now can really help them later on when the focus will be on them to be their best self-advocate. Working on developing organization, time management, and stress management skills now while they're in high school. Making sure that your son or daughter uses some kind of time management schedule, keeps track of their assignments for their high school classes on either an old school high school agenda or daily planner. There's many free apps out there that help students keep track of assignments and due dates. Whatever it is, the student needs to start working on some of those skills now about writing down assignments, writing down due dates, and in addition, having the stress management skills to be able to deal with multiple assignments from multiple teachers. And so working on some of those skills now would be really beneficial later on. The other skills to start practicing now before they leave for college are simple things like doing laundry, money management, getting themselves into a schedule, being much more independent with the tasks for daily living that suddenly, if they go away to college, they may be expected to do. We also encourage that students take academically challenging classes while they're still in high school. Oftentimes, students feel like they've earned the right to have an easy senior year, but that often leads to a really rude awakening the following fall when they go to college and suddenly they're taking 4 or 5 classes that are very, very demanding, and they haven't been used to that rigor in at least a year. So really trying to make sure the student, if going to college is a goal for the student, try to have as rigorous a schedule as possible where the student can still be successful, but stretches themselves and challenges themselves. And some area colleges also offer dual credit, reduced tuition possibly for high school students. So it wouldn't be unusual for a student to try out a college class either over the summer or in the evening during their senior year, just to see if they are gaining the skills to be ready for college after their senior year. Another option for some students is to consider attending college part-time. Sometimes taking 2 or 3 courses in their first semester can often help with the transition. Though sometimes students and parents worry, they want to make sure they graduate on time and they don't want it to take too long, and these are understandable concerns. However, oftentimes, depending on the student, they can actually be more successful if they start off a little bit more slowly with a part-time first semester to get used to what it's like to being a college student. Students can then add more credits in subsequent semesters to sort of catch up, if you will, but we often try to emphasize that it's not a race and everybody is on a different plane when it comes to college, and everybody needs to do it in a way that's comfortable for them and that they can be successful. Another concern that sometimes people have is that there's often a regulation that to live on campus, students often have to be full-time. But many residence life programs will allow students with disabilities to live in the residence halls even though they're registered part-time as an accommodation. If this sounds like an option that you would like to pursue, you should contact the residence life office of the colleges that you're admitted to and advocate and provide documentation that you would like to live in the residence halls but still be a part-time student. So some tips for success in college. These may sound simple, but you would be surprised at how challenging these 4 concepts are for many students. The first is go to class. While this sounds really simple, when you come to college, going to class is often voluntary. Nobody's going to make a student go to a college class. Oftentimes they are absolutely not going to report back to parents that students are not attending class because college is very much an adult environment. So going to class is really important. But students often sometimes, unfortunately, lack the motivation or direction. And if it's a choice, sometimes they choose not to go to class. And if you do go to class, make sure that you go prepared, having pen and paper, computer, tablet, whatever you need to do to take notes, and having read the class assignment, the reading assignment before class. But actually showing up is one of the biggest challenges. Doing the homework. A lot of times students think of homework as something that's assigned today and is due in the next day or two, but homework is actually reading chapters, taking notes from chapters, starting drafts of assignments that might not be due for the next couple of weeks. So making sure that you're staying engaged in your coursework, because it can very quickly get overwhelming and students can get behind. So stay up on homework and do the homework. Advocate for yourself and use resources. Many colleges offer free tutoring, free one-on-one help, but students have to be able to ask for help. And a lot of times students don't use resources until they get themselves into difficulty. Oftentimes we'll suggest to students, hey, why don't you get a tutor? And students will say, I don't need a tutor yet. And a lot of times that means they're not failing yet. Don't wait until you're failing to use resources. Reach out early in the semester and get hooked up with tutoring centers and other support centers that can help you be successful. And finally, get involved. Oftentimes, you're going to college to get an entire experience. So making sure that you're looking into clubs and organizations where you could apply what you're learning in the classroom to real life situations, and also to just have a good time. College is a balance of learning, studying, growing, and interacting with others and enjoying the time that you have for that. So make sure that you get involved. We hope you found this presentation useful. For more information, contact your student special education teacher at Fairport High School.